Coming up, crafting a successful strategy.
The point about strategy is, first, it's a thing that everybody believes that they now need in almost every area of their lives.
Sir Lawrence Friedman of King's College London discusses the importance of strategy in politics, business, and revolution. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Our speaker is Sir Lawrence Friedman, who is unquestionably one of the world's leading authorities on war, international politics, and strategy. It is our privilege to host him at the Carnegie Council as he discusses his latest book, Strategy, A History.
The point about strategy is, first, it's a thing that everybody believes that they now need in almost every area of their life. So there's very few activities where there's not a strategy on offer, whether it's sorting out your tax returns or bringing up an infant or a counselling strategy. There's always strategies around. Yet at the same time, it's seen as something that is essential for governments, for big corporations, for military to have. And indeed, if things are going badly, it's often put down to the fact that they don't have a good strategy. The word itself, strategist, comes from the Greek, the art of the general. That's, for much of the time, how it was seen. The contemporary concept of strategy, because the word wasn't really used very much, really until the late 18th century, the contemporary concept of strategy was really a consequence both of the Enlightenment and, you would argue, the Napoleonic Wars. It reflects a view that if only you can get the analysis right, the understanding right, the right sort of knowledge, apply, in effect, science of some sort, that you will get a far better set of answers than you would have done otherwise. And it also reflected amongst in the military context where it was first used, the sense that under Napoleon, something very different was going on that was demonstrating that those who were able to apply this higher understanding of war were able to get great results. There's a line in War and Peace where discussing the build-up to the 1812 in Russia, where a very skeptical old count is saying, and tell me how you are going to defeat the French with this new science of strategy, which was seen to be a very German concept. Clausewitz, in fact, appears in War and Peace in a not very flattering light. And Tolstoy, of course, was the great skeptic as far as strategy goes. But the idea, essentially, was that if you applied military force effectively, you could win a decisive victory. And it's this decisiveness that was critical to the early concept. And you can see it in some of the great military thinkers of the early 19th century, such as Jomini, as well as Clausewitz. The idea of decisiveness, that not only could you do better in battle, but you could use it in such a way as to properly defeat the opponent. And this notion of decisiveness in war is one which is still associated with strategy. When contemporary military strategists think about their role, it is often similarly in terms of finding a way to cause such a defeat of the enemy's armed forces that political results follow. And then you can see this moving across into the political sphere in the sort of 1830s, 40s, as we get professional revolutionaries appearing, who are almost like the general staff of the developing proletariat or the masses, trying to work out how they can gain a decisive victory over the elites, over the monarchs, with the French Revolution in their mind as a model of a decisive victory. So this idea of decisiveness and the application of science, think Marx's claims about what he was able to do, is also there when you get into revolutionary strategy. From the 1960s on, strategy in business has also been presented as a way of getting the decisive result. And it's worth also thinking about the early writings on business strategy, which were essentially about large corporations and how they could maintain their position, just like a lot of the early military strategy was about how large states could maintain their positions. Now, Out of all of this, the starting assumption was that if you got the right strategy, you could in some way control your environment. You could manipulate events so that you would be in a better position to your enemies, your rivals, your competitors, whether in business, politics, or in military affairs. And of course, the experience of application of strategy is this is very difficult indeed, that in practice you don't get control in the same way that you would like to get control. In the idea of a decisive military victory kept on getting knocked backwards because the people didn't accept that just because their military had been defeated, that they had been defeated. So popular resistance grew up. Or, as Napoleon discovered in 1812 in Russia, even if you could defeat the enemy army at Borodino, it didn't mean to say that they were completely down and out. And there you were, stuck in the middle of an inhospitable country with the climate coming down on you, and you were stranded, and you weren't quite sure of your next step. And so actually the practice of military strategy is full of example after example of a failure to assert this sort of control. And one of the legacies of Clausewitz, which I wouldn't particularly blame him, is the belief that if only you can get your victory in early and make it really decisive, then it's a knockout blow, so that even though you may be fighting an enemy with potentially superior resources, that they can that they will be taken out of the battle, out of the conflict early on, and you will be in charge. But the experience of the Schlieffen Plan in 1914, or of Blitzkrieg in 1914, certainly against the Russians, more so even than in Europe, in Western Europe, demonstrates that you think you've got a knockout blow, but you don't. And the failure to get it means that you're stuck in a long, arduous, crippling war of attrition. So we have plenty of examples of, on the military side, of a failure to get this decisive victory, but a real difficulty in the literature, in the military literature, of finding a way to accommodate this and talking about outcomes that are less than optimal, not quite what you want, something short of victory that requires bargaining and negotiation. Interestingly, it was only with the development of nuclear weapons where the idea of a knockout blow came to be seen increasingly as fantasy. The largely civilian strategists who wrote about nuclear issues actually started to incorporate bargaining and negotiation into their theory, something that's quite absent from a lot of mainstream military writing. If you take even the business community as well, when they think about the original writing from the early 60s, it was largely about how the big corporations, the big conglomerates, the General Electric, the General Motors, or whatever, could sustain a market position that was almost limited by antitrust laws. I mean, they couldn't actually go for much more market share. So the question was profitability. And that largely meant looking inwards into the organization to see how it could be optimized to have the maximum effect. If you look at the original writing, whether it's from Drucker or Arthur Chandler, people like this on business strategy, the word competition doesn't really appear. That's not what it was about. It was only as the 60s turned into the 70s, and particularly the Japanese, but also the German challenge to American manufacturing predominance took over, that actually people became utterly preoccupied with competition. And you see in business strategy, in a sense, an opposite development from the military, whereas the military stick at attempts to try to work out how they can defeat the enemy in battle. On the business side, there's a continuing search for the bright new idea, the bright new way of doing things, the new processes that will give you the distinctive competitive advantage. And in politics, I mean, the revolutionaries from the start were stuck with an enormous gap between what they wanted and the resources they had at their disposal. So if we think of strategies in terms of available means and desired ends, the gap was just enormous, but they kept on trying to find different ways. And I found the revolutionaries an interesting way to get into a lot of issues, because actually the most interesting strategic issues are faced by the underdog. I mean, if you've got enormous power and you can basically get your way, whatever, without much effort, then strategy isn't very interesting. Strategy is only interesting when it really allows you to be much more creative with your resources than you would otherwise have been. So they try to have great creativity. And I show basically how the approach that they adopted as they tried to understand why they kept on failing was to draw attention to the problem of what the Marxists would call false consciousness, but basically that people weren't thinking the right way, and that somehow the constructs with which people approached the world were the hardest, had been manipulated, they would say, by the ruling classes, and were very hard to undermine and challenge by the revolutionary movement. Now, we can trace how all that happened, but the important legacy of all of this, over time, this idea of influencing how people think became one of the most challenging ideas in strategy. Now, in the political world, we're very used to this now. Everybody's got a narrative. Everybody talks about messages and narratives all the time. And in some of the literature, it is almost as if the narrative is something that can be sort of conjured up as sort of a precision-guided intellectual bomb that can be put inside people's mind and make them, people who once thought they were Republicans, vote Democrat, or vice versa, and so on. But the narrative has now taken hold as being the thing that you want to be in charge of. If it's your narrative that frames the debate, then you're one step ahead of the opposition. And actually, you can see this idea in other areas, in the other areas I've been talking about as well. You can see it in the military side. So as counterinsurgency developed and the methods that the US forces had been using in Iraq and Afghanistan didn't seem to be getting much traction, you can see there the efforts by those who were aware of a long literature of counterinsurgency to revive the idea of hearts and minds, to revive the idea that it's not good enough just to show that you're stronger than others, that you can beat people up, but that you also have an ability to win them over. Joe Nye's idea of soft power, to some extent, comes into this category. What sort of concept of strategy emerges from all of this? Well, the challenge I'm trying to pose in the book is to the idea of strategy as a plan. A lot of people think of strategies as being synonymous with planning, but it's not, because a plan is something where there is a sequence of events leading to a desired outcome, and you have to assume that if you start at one point, which move will build on the one before and take you to where you want to be. And you only have to say it to realize how unlikely this is going to be in situations involving other willful human beings. Very famously, von Moltke, the great Prussian field marshal, observed that no plan survives contact with the enemy. My favorite happens to be Mike Tyson's observation: everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. So a plan isn't a particularly good way to think about strategy, because for all the reasons I've given, they don't work out as you would expect. Secondly, from what I've said, it's important to see it's more than a duel. Often strategy is presented as a duel, as if you have one opponent. So say you are fighting Mike Tyson and he looms large and menacing. Well, one way you might do it is to try to trick him in some way. Look at the early fights of Muhammad Ali. But another way is to break the rules completely and bring in somebody else to help you. And actually, if you go back to chimps, the observations that have been done on those, when the alpha male gets challenged, it's rarely challenged by somebody else trying to beat up the alpha male. It's often because they find a partner to do it together. Coalition formation actually seems to me to be one of the most important features of successful strategy, finding somebody else to help you. Now, it's important to say that because a lot of writing on strategy, which is influenced by, I'd say particularly by Sun Tzu, but the great thing about Sun Tzu, Chinese strategist from way back when, is that actually it says you're going to beat your opponent by being cleverer than them. And you get the idea of Sun Tzu quite quickly. Basically, whatever the opponent thinks you're going to do, you do the opposite. If he thinks you're going to attack, you retreat. If he thinks you're weak, you've got to show that you're strong. If he thinks you're strong, you've got to show that you're weak. And so it's quite an easy formula to apply. But the basic problem is it's great until you find somebody who's as clever as you are, or indeed cleverer. I mean, who wouldn't want a strategy that assumes that it's your cleverness that's going to win the day? It appeals to everybody's vanity, but isn't necessarily a good way or the only way of getting results. And there are a number of problems with a Sun Tzu type strategy. In the book, I look at David and Goliath, which is everybody's underdog beats the giant iconic moment. Actually, the importance of David and Goliath is about, the original relevance was about belief in God. It wasn't anything to do with cleverness. It was about belief in God as being the thing you need to be successful in war. But everybody knows it as a story of David, in a sense, a form of asymmetric warfare, where he has this giant clad in armor, and he picks up some stones from a stream and gets his sling and knocks Goliath down, chops off his head, and the Philistines retreat. It was brilliant as far as it goes, but it's not hard to work out the problems with that strategy. First, it depended on the knockout blow. So if it had just pinged off his armor, that wouldn't have been particularly effective, and he would have looked rather vulnerable. Secondly, it required the Philistines to accept that this was a reasonable outcome of something they thought was going to develop in a different way. And third, of course, you can only do this once. Next time the giant is going to be better prepared. And that actually, if you look historically, that's been the problem with the sort of the great sort of tricksters and crafty figures, whether it's, say, Odysseus being the original archetype, is nobody believed a word they said because they knew they were tricksters. You can do it once, but you can't keep on doing it. So it seems to me that the wise strategy is one that involves not relying on your cleverness, though cleverness is useful and intelligence is always worth applying, but actually the most effective strategies when you're an underdog is to find friends or supporters or even people who just happen to have a coincidence of interest. So if you look at, say, Churchill in 1940, first point you note about Churchill in 1940 was that strategy was not about winning at that point, just sheer survival. And a lot of strategy is not about how to get to victory, but how to survive. But secondly, he saw from day one that what he needed to do was to bring the Americans in, and so established the connections with Roosevelt. That was his strategy. It was to find the most powerful supporter. And when Hitler invaded Russia, and people remarked on his past anti-Bolshevism, he said that if Hitler invaded hell, he would have a good word to say for Satan in the House of Commons. The basis of success often is to find friends. So where does that leave us with thinking about strategy? If you hear people talk about what's needed for a strategy, they'll often start with objectives. What is it we're trying to achieve? Where are we trying to get to? And then somehow working backwards from that. I argue it's the other way around. Most of the time with strategy, it's what's the problem we face at the moment? How do we diagnose it? And how do we look for ways of getting around it? Now, obviously, you need to think about the steps after the next step. But actually, a lot of strategy is getting to the next step. It's not, by the time you've got to the next step, and certainly the step after that, the possibilities in the situation will have changed. Sometimes for the better, there are more possibilities. Sometimes you've got to scale down your aspirations. And therefore, one of the messages in the book is to move away from this idea of strategy as being about a plan that will get you to your desired objectives, and criticizing people all the time for failure in that regard, and to recognize it's an essential but limited activity. It's about the problems you face at the moment and trying to work sensible ways through them, and how you get to an outcome, and that the problem with the outcome is you have to start all over again. So though at the end of the book I sort of compare strategy to drama, the great advantage for the dramatist is they can bring everything to a comfortable conclusion, but the strategist never stops. You win an election, you've got to run the country. You have a coup, you've got to run the country. You win a battle, there may be another battle to come. It's a soap opera. It's not a three-act drama. It's continual. And again, that seems to me one of the important points about it. And it goes back to challenging this original idea of strategy as leading to a decisive victory, because there isn't, in the end, such a thing. There are forms of decision, but they just create the conditions for the next stage. And unless you're thinking through to the next stage, and potentially the stage after that, you're doomed to disappointment.
It is widely assumed that Putin has a strategy and Obama does not. Your comments?
Putin has a strategy, has a clear view. Whether it's a good strategy or not, as a general course, we'll have to see. But he has certain concerns about Russia and Russia's position in the world, that it has to be seen as a great power, that it can't be ignored, mustn't be taken for granted. It is an example of a strategy responding to the concerns of the moment, which is what I think strategies do. But of course, that demonstrates also a problem of not being sure where it's going. As far as Obama goes, and I think it's true for all strategy, these to some extent are questions of power, and your ability to calculate the balances of power, to see where strengths lie, and so on, and to work out how to overcome it. I mean, that's essentially a lot of the time what we're talking about with strategy. Obama, as a president of the United States, one assumes has enormous power, but actually when it comes to bargaining in Washington, turns out it's circumscribed. A strategy for Obama, I think, without me wishing to interfere into the internal politics of a friendly state, I think it's always going to be one of having to find some ways of appealing above the heads of Congress, which is what previous presidents have been able to do in similar circumstances. And that seems to be what he's found very difficult to do. Though, for somebody who is such an orator and wordsmith, you would have thought he would find the means.
Until now, you've been emphasizing the role of great powers who have great power to use. But what about the small states who are confronting America? I mean, now Iran, Syria, and others. What are their strategies and their possibilities?
If you try to understand the politics of the Middle East, the most important priority for all the regimes was their own survival. Not necessarily their country's survival, the regime's survival. And I wrote that came out in 2008, and unfortunately, this sort of theme of regime survival gets stronger and stronger. Syria being the example. I mean, it's not Syria is not challenging the United States. Syria is challenging its own people, and then you get the strategies of those who are challenging Assad and so on. Iran is a slightly different case, but again, the question for all non-democracies is in the end regime survival, because they're never quite sure about the consensual basis of their rule. And so that's always struck me as being a pretty good starting point. But one of my favorite books is called The Mouse That Roared. The idea was that a country that was down and out and suffering was trying to work out how it could do well, and it noticed that if you fought the United States and lost, you seemed to do very well out of it. And so they tried to find a way of going to war with the United States. I think they got a doomsday weapon or something, which looked like they might actually win. There's a variety of ways by which small countries approach the United States, and of course a lot of them challenging. But the important thing to remember about contemporary international politics is large numbers of small countries depend on the United States, and that's still the case. People talk about the rise of China and the decline of the United States. The fact is that there's about 70 countries with some sort of relationship, security relationship with the United States. And what has China got? North Korea. There's a very asymmetrical relationship. And so for most countries, the United States is still seen as the power with which they wish to be associated. And you've got to be pretty, for populist reasons, sometimes because you're really annoyed with the Americans, sometimes you try and take them on. But there's limits to how far you can go successfully with that. So most of the time, most of these countries are thinking about survival. I think that's, if you're small and weak, that's your first priority. Very few of them are thinking about victory. It's just survival.
I'd like to invite you all joining me in thanking Sir Lawrence. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.